My name is Marina Gerner, and I'm the author of the Vagina Business, the innovative breakthroughs that could change everything in women's health. And my book is about FemTech, which stands for female technology. That's technology focused on female bodies. And so for my book, I've interviewed 100 experts across 15 countries, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of health tech products targeting women. And I think it's important to say that over the last few years, a gap has opened between the demands of patients and the attitude of the medical establishment. So the question is, who steps into that gap? And it's both good and bad actors. So I want to empower women to understand how to navigate the femtech market. So let's start with the OG of femtech, period apps. If you want to use a period app, how do you decide which one to download? There are currently over 300 period apps on the market, and they vary in quality, they vary in how they're regulated. And it really depends on who they're produced by. So what began as period tracking or menstrual cycle tracking has moved into fertility tracking and then into digital contraception. So from when to expect your next period, to when to increase your chances of conception, to when to avoid pregnancy. And you can tell that each claim is stronger and riskier than the previous one. So we need to differentiate between those categories of apps. And before I talk about the period app space, let's say a few things about the menstrual cycle itself, because that's something many of us don't actually know that much about. There is a very common myth that the normal menstrual cycle has 28 days. And that's not correct. According to large-scale studies, only 13% of women have a 28-day cycle. It's actually much closer to 30 days. And there's a lot of variation. And so that's something to be aware of, because when you're choosing an app, you can see whether it is built on 28 days or whether it's more flexible in how it uses the calendar. Something else that's really important to know is that when we ovulate an egg once in our cycle, the egg lives for up to 24 hours. But then why do you have a fertile window, right? You have a day of ovulation and you also have a fertile window that's got several days. And that is there because you could potentially still get pregnant in a window of more than one day, because sperm lives for longer than 24 hours, could live for up to 5 days or more. So that's why there's a fertile window. There are several companies that produce period apps. There are some companies like Clue, for example, that started out as a period app company, and they've put a lot of thought into how to create their product. And then there are other companies that usually focus on utilities or gaming that decided to create a period app because they saw, there's a gap in the market, there's demand for it, it's just another place where we can put adverts. So they didn't put any thought into the product itself or into the privacy policies around it. So I would always recommend looking at who the producer, who the company is that's behind the app that you're looking at. In academic studies done by Laura Shipp and Catherine Chen, for example, Clue tends to do really well. And the company is based in Germany, which is worth mentioning because the European Union has some of the strictest privacy regulation rules in the world. It's called GDPR, and European law protects health data and personal data. So using an app that was developed under the European Union is a good idea. When you look at the app, it's worth looking what the privacy policy is, whether they have a privacy policy. It's usually a red flag if they ask for access to your camera or for access to your microphone. Why would they need that? They don't. There are some apps that are privacy first as well. One example is Drip. And then when you look at this app, I would recommend putting the name of the app into Google and adding the word scandal or adding the word privacy, and then see what comes up. The other question to look into is, how is it regulated? So there is actually only one app that is certified as a digital contraceptive in Europe, and that is Natural Cycles. It's also FDA approved in the US. The second app that has been cleared by the FDA in the US is Clue, so the conception version of Clue. An FDA clearance means that it was deemed to be similar enough to an already existing product that has already been approved, which is Natural Cycles. So all other apps are not actually approved or certified for contraceptive purposes. And that's something that's worth knowing. Which leads us to the topic of contraception. In the contraceptive space, women try an average of 3 to 4 different contraceptive methods in our lifetimes. And for 91% of us, there is no contraceptive method that has all the features we find extremely important. And when it comes to contraception, there's something called the Pearl Index. So what is the Pearl Index? It measures the effectiveness of any contraceptive. And the effectiveness of a contraceptive depends on whether it is used correctly. So to assess this, clinical trials use the Pearl Index, which describes the number of pregnancies occurring per 100 women over 1 year with perfect use of the contraceptive, so how it's intended to be used, and with typical use of the contraceptive. So that is how people actually use it. So condoms, for example, are 98% effective with perfect use, but only 87% effective with typical use. And as with any contraceptive, the failure rate tends to be bigger in the first year of use because people are learning, usually, how to use something, unless it's an IUD and it's there and it's doing its own thing. When copper and hormonal IUDs, for example, are 99% effective. So for Natural Cycles, the Pearl Index, and they've done the research, it's 98% effective with perfect use and 93% effective with typical use. So it's worth noting that according to a study led by the company itself, fewer than 10% of the cycles recorded on the app are perfect use cycles, which means that the vast majority are 93% effective with typical use. And so when you're choosing a contraceptive, ask yourself, what do I need to do to achieve perfect use? So with Natural Cycles, you have to track your cycle every day. And you have to input all of that data. And you have to use contraceptives like condoms on what they call red days, so in your fertile window. Something else to ask yourself is, what are the side effects? Right? So hormonal contraception has side effects for some people, but non-hormonal contraceptives like the copper IUD can also have side effects for people. Something else I'd recommend is looking at what other people are saying about the contraception that they use. And there's a FemTech platform called The Lowdown, where you can actually put in the names of very specific brands of the birth control pill, for example, and you can compare them side by side. It's the biggest review platform on contraception, and it's a treasure trove of information. So I would recommend exploring that platform. The other thing is that your choice will depend on your lifestyle and on your plans in life and how well you know your own body, because there are things that can disrupt our menstrual cycle, which would make tracking it digitally more risky. So if you're somebody who travels very frequently. Travel can delay your menstrual cycle, or having a cold or being stressed. All of these things can potentially delay your cycle, and that makes it harder to track. Whereas some women I've spoken to have a very regular menstrual cycle and they work like clockwork. So it does depend on what your menstrual cycle is like and how well you know your own body, what stage of life you're at. And it's worth remembering that digital contraception is a form of fertility-based awareness method. So it's a whole range of methods that often includes measuring your temperature first thing in the morning, tracking the dates of your cycle. You can do it on a piece of paper as well. And some people do. And if you look at research on how well these methods work, there's a really broad spectrum because it depends on how well you're taught to analyze your cycle and how well you do it. So there's a real range. The quality of our eggs declines as we get older. Our fertility peaks in our 20s, and then it's a downward slope, which gets deeper after the age of 35, but it's not a cliff. It's still a slope. And the thought behind egg freezing is that you can preserve your eggs that are statistically likely to be of a higher quality at a younger age for a pregnancy at a later stage. So egg freezing, or its technical name oocyte cryopreservation, was developed in the 1980s to be used for medical reasons. The idea behind medical egg freezing is to preserve the eggs of someone who's about to have fertility-threatening procedures. It can be a protective measure against chemotherapy, for example, which diminishes fertility, as well as medical conditions including autoimmune disorders and severe endometriosis. It is also used by trans men who would like to preserve their fertility. With the development of vitrification, a more reliable freezing technique, egg freezing was commercialized for non-medical reasons. In 2012, both the American Society of Reproductive Medicine and the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology decided to lift the experimental label of the egg freezing procedure. Since then, social egg freezing has been on the rise. It is offered to healthy younger women who wish to postpone motherhood. Kim Kardashian froze her eggs. Jennifer Aniston has said she regrets not freezing her eggs. On TikTok, influencers upload videos of their daily injections and reels about their trips abroad to have their eggs frozen. Every woman is different when it comes to how age affects her fertility. Some women do not suffer infertility in their early 40s. Egg freezing typically works best for those in their 20s and 30s, and it is not usually recommended for women over 38 years. And yet, research shows that the average age of egg freezing in the UK and United States is 38. The main motivation is to buy time to find a partner, according to research done by Yale University. The procedure involves daily injections for about 8 to 14 days to stimulate a group of eggs to mature and develop. During this time, ultrasounds and blood tests determine whether the medication is working. Retrieving the eggs is usually done under general anesthetic or sedation. Once the eggs are inspected by an embryologist and deemed usable, they can be frozen. In my research, I have found that the fertility industry does not give women enough transparency on both the cost involved in the procedure and the risk. So oftentimes they don't mention the potential side effects of the medication that's used to stimulate the ovaries for egg retrieval, such as headaches, fatigue, cramping. They don't mention rare but potentially really serious complications, such as ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And I have attended events where fertility companies have said, we don't want to get too technical, but if I wanted to freeze my eggs, I would like to know all of the evidence and the risks involved and the costs up front. So there are multiple components that make up the cost of the procedure. There's the consultation, the medication, blood tests, screening. There's the actual egg retrieval and the freezing cycle, more likely several cycles. And then you also have the storage of the eggs. So there's a fee, an annual fee for that. The third part is the transfer of the eggs to attempt a pregnancy. And oftentimes, fertility clinics will only show you one part of this cost. Something else they don't reveal a lot of the time is how many eggs we need to freeze to have a chance of a live birth. So I've heard clinics say, oh, you can just freeze a few eggs and you'll be fine. And that's not the case. So if you're 36 years old, for example, you'd have to freeze 25 eggs to have at least one live birth, to have a high chance of having that. And sometimes people refer to egg freezing as a kind of insurance, but insurance pays out, whereas there's no guarantee that frozen eggs will definitely be viable and that it will definitely work out. So that's something else to be aware of. I have a chapter in the book where I talk about FemTech versus ScamTech.